Welcome to our Bible study. We continue our study tonight of the different kingdom parables of Jesus. But before we enter into the study tonight of one specific parable, there are a couple of things I'd like to remind everybody about. First of all, we are having our worship services at the Oakwood Road Church of Christ on Sunday mornings at 9:30. These services last approximately 45 minutes. We record these services, and barring any issues, they should be available by 11 o'clock on our church website. At 6 o'clock on Sunday night, we have another worship service, and then Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, we have Bible classes, again, for all ages. In addition, of course, to our services, there are various other congregations that are virtually presenting their services, whether it be on Facebook Live or YouTube or some other venue. And so you're able to worship virtually in this time. Obviously, we realize some people are unable to be out physically with other Christians, and we're glad that we have these resources. I would encourage those who are able to be out and to attend other events and be around people, perhaps at work and so forth, to not forsake our gatherings together. The importance of worshiping together. Again, if there's a health problem or some limitation because along that line, we understand. But if we're able to do everything else in our lives, then I think we do have a responsibility to meet with Christians as we come together on the first day of the week. Having said that, there are some other resources which are obviously available. The Phil Sanders in Search of the Lord's Way program. Phil Sanders is the speaker on that program. Direct TV Sunday mornings at 7:30, Channel 47. Dish TV, Channel 239. Spectrum Cable, Channel 3. And also the Gospel Broadcasting Network and the World Video Bible School. These are two excellent resources. As I've mentioned, there's more material there than you'd even couldn't probably read through in a lifetime, but they do have tremendous amounts of Bible study materials. And this material, most of it is free or available at a very minimal charge. And so we have the resources available. We need to take advantage of this. As I've mentioned so many times, generations gone by before the advent of even radio, television, and later on the internet and so forth, that we were so limited as far as having access to some of these resources. But now, instantly, we can study our Bibles, learn about our Bibles so much better than we have in times gone by. We've been studying the church now for a couple of months, and we mentioned the fact that the church was in God's mind even before the creation of humanity. I think this is a very important point for people who sort of minimize the importance of the church. But in Ephesians, the 3rd chapter, we find that God tells us through the Apostle Paul that even before God created us, he had in mind the church, and that church was to reflect the manifold wisdom of God, which means variegated. Some illustrations have been that the rainbow has various colors to show all these spectacular colors. It's variegated. In a similar way, the church reflects God's wisdom. It's multicolored. So we think of that, the idea that the church is just as Christ is a solution, obviously, to the problems of the world. Christ saves us through the church. And when the church follows Christ, then obviously we see this manifold wisdom or variegated wisdom. The kingdom prophecies of the Old Testament are fulfilled in the church in the New Testament. And this is, as we not only have noticed from our previous studies of these prophecies, but also and as we study some of the kingdom parables of Jesus, we understand that these prophecies specifically address the nature of the church. Christ promised also to build his church, so the church is definitely something important. Again, as I've mentioned in almost every one of these lessons, I understand people become cynical of organized religion for various reasons. Many times, high-profile individuals and even ministries have been brought down and been disappointing. But just because there are some people who claim to be following Christ that are hypocritical doesn't mean the church is not important. The church, as we go to the New Testament, is a part of God's eternal plan, and obviously we need to respect what God teaches concerning it. Having said that, as we also have mentioned, the church is not an earthly kingdom. By earthly kingdom, meaning that it's not some kingdom just to be a force in culture or to change society. And obviously, when people obey the gospel, we have a better culture, a better society. But Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." John 18:36. Jesus didn't use physical armies to further his cause, but rather he did through the teaching and preaching of God's word. Second, the church is not a forerunner to an earthly kingdom, and this has been so prevalent in our culture and our society that Christ came to establish this kingdom and he was defeated in that effort. So God established the church as sort of an afterthought, sort of a last second mistake or last second substitute, so to speak, for the kingdom. The Bible very simply does not teach this. As a matter of fact, the words church and kingdom are used interchangeably in Matthew 16:18 through 19. And also, the church is not a denomination. I truly believe that if we try to follow Christ in our lives, follow his teachings, and submit to him, and be the church that we read about in the New Testament, that we can be God's church or the church that belongs to Christ. I frequently will ask people, what denomination was the Apostle Paul a member of, or the Apostle Peter, or these other individual Christians in the New Testament. And we understand they weren't members of a denomination, but they were members of a church that belonged to God and to Christ. With that in mind, we've been studying, of course, parables. The word parable literally means to throw something alongside. Jesus would throw parables alongside his teaching to illustrate a point to the audience or use them in response to questions. And of course, a parable is a story or saying that's meant to teach a specific point to provoke a response, obviously, from the listener. Many of Jesus' parables involve everyday events and things that people could relate to, whether it be sowing seed, kneading bread, or allowing bread to rise. The mustard seed, as we'll look at in just a few minutes, or other events as far as how people treat their laborers, how servants respond to their masters, and things of that nature, so people could understand them. And also, parables are easy to remember. I've mentioned, I believe, every week that I can remember as a small child singing the song about the wise man and the foolish man. And it sticks in our brains. And yet, that's one of the parables of Jesus that talks about the importance of obedience there in Matthew, the 7th chapter. The excuse me, parables also were told to conceal the truth from some. As we have mentioned from Matthew, the 13th chapter, he quotes from Isaiah, where Isaiah prophesies that God is going to speak in parables or speak through parables. And the reason being, it appears that the people maybe prematurely were going to want to anoint Jesus as king, so he didn't always tell them the truth directly in that sense. At times, it was sort of veiled through parables, but also for the Pharisees. Jesus didn't want the Pharisees to kill. God didn't want Jesus killed by the Pharisees ahead of time. And so Jesus would speak in parables, which sort of confounded or confused the Pharisees. And sometimes he would explain these parables in private to his disciples, as the last 2 weeks we've examined a couple of parables that Jesus actually explained to his disciples. Having said that, we're going to look tonight very simply at this one little parable, the parable of the mustard seed. It says, another parable he put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is greater than the herbs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. Unfortunately, Jesus doesn't give us an inspired understanding or interpretation of this parable. This parable is very similar to the parable of the leaven, as we will look at next Wednesday night, having to do with the fact that small things can turn into something great. The mustard seed, technically, I guess, is not the smallest seed in the world, but it's a little seed, and of course, it produces a very large tree. And the point being here that the kingdom is like that. It starts out as something very small, and it's going to grow into something powerful. As a matter of fact, it's so powerful that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. And so I think as we can look at this parable, we can see the growth of the kingdom coming from something very small, very humble beginnings, and turning into a worldwide entity. First of all, the kingdom would have a small beginning, and that's obvious from this parable. I think just obvious from Bible history. Even Jesus' beginnings were very small. Small from the standpoint of Jesus was a very humble person. He came from Nazareth, which was basically a backwoods town, backwater town, so to speak, that maybe was made fun of. He didn't go to the study at the feet of the Pharisees, the scholars, and so forth. And so he was ridiculed for being just this common person. He was a carpenter, the son of a carpenter. But this actually was prophesied. In Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 1 concerning the Messiah, there shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The basic point here is that there's going to be a descendant from Jesse, who of course was the father of David, and David being a type of Jesus in many ways. But it says a branch is going to grow out of his roots. So in other words, this small beginning. This descendant of David's going to start out with small beginnings, but turn into something great. And even in Isaiah 53, this description of Jesus, I think sometimes we forget about, but especially today when we think of charismatic individuals and people who we might say are very physically attractive, they're great speakers, the perfect hair, perfect teeth, the whole the whole 9 yards. Jesus wasn't described as a person like that. He says, "He shall grow up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness." In other words, Jesus wasn't so physically attractive for some reason people would be drawn to him. And when we see him, there's no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Just think for a second about the influence Jesus has had on this world. And think of also the attitudes toward him 2,000 years ago. None of those people probably would have assumed or even had the smallest inkling that from this person who came from Nazareth, was raised in Nazareth, that he was going to he and his disciples would turn the world upside down. And the world would never be the same, all because of Jesus, from a very small, humble beginning. Well, even as we look at some of these prophecies, the kingdom is going to have a small beginning. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream in Daniel, the second chapter, and in the dream, there's this statue standing there made up of 4 different metals, and we find eventually that, as he says here, these different metals or whatever comprise 4 different world empires, and the 4th empire would be the Roman Empire, the empire that was in power, of course, whenever Jesus came into this world. And this bronze statue was made of iron, clay, bronze, and silver. And gold, they were crushed together, became like chaff from the several threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. That stone is Jesus. That stone is the church. And we read on about it later on here in Daniel, the second chapter. But think about it. The Babylonian Empire has come and gone. The Greek Medo-Persian Empire has come and gone. Even the Greek Empire has come and gone. The Roman Empire, which was going to last forever, has come and gone. And yet today, God's church still exists. So later on, Daniel says this in Daniel 2:44 this is about in the days of the Roman Empire. In the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it will stand forever. Just stop and reflect on this for just a few seconds, that here are basically 12 common, uneducated as far as maybe schooling with schools in Jerusalem, things of that nature, but basically humble people. We know that some of them were fishermen. Matthew was a tax collector, but basically they're just the common average everyday Judeans. And we find that these individuals are going to be the kind of people who were going to teach and preach and change the whole world. And their leader was a person who came from humble beginnings, basically never owned anything in this world. He even depended on others for his existence. That he said he didn't have even a place to lay his head at night. So that's how the church started out. It started out from very, very small beginnings, and it evolved into what it is today. When we go to the book of Acts, we read about the growth. We find that the first part of the second chapter of Acts was 120 disciples together, and we find that number grows after the day of Pentecost, or on the day of Pentecost, to over 3,000. Acts chapter 2, verse 41 says, "Those who gladly received his word were baptized, and that day about 3,000 souls were added to them. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and prayers." And then that group quickly grows to about 5,000, or at least about 5,000 men. In Acts, the 4th chapter, and in verse 4, it says, "However, many of those who heard the word believed, and the number of the men came to be about 5,000. And then as we continue through the book of Acts, we come down to Acts in the 9th chapter, and this is after this is after there's a persecution that comes on the church in Acts the 8th chapter, and the church begins, I guess the good fact of the persecution is the church begins to spread the gospel abroad. There's a good outline of the book of Acts. I can remember from I took it in college. The teacher emphasizing that in Acts 1, Jesus told his apostles they'd be witnesses of him in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the uttermost parts of the earth. And that's an outline of the book of Acts. The church starts in Jerusalem, it spreads through Judea, eventually goes to Samaria, and then throughout the New Testament world. But in Acts chapter 9 and in verse 31, here's what we find concerning the growth of the church following that persecution that we read about in Acts the 8th chapter. It says, the churches throughout all Judea, Galilee, and Samaria had peace and were edified, and walking in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, they were multiplied. And then as we continue through the book of Acts, we find that the church is established throughout the New Testament world. And we look at it today, 2,000 years later. I realize there are many different so-called flavors of Christianity and aspects of it. Obviously, some people, some organized religion today is closer to truth than others. But the bottom line is that the true church that was established about 2,000 years ago is going to continue to be in existence for a long, long time when these world empires had been destroyed. And so small beginnings, the small mustard seed turned into something great. Having said that, I think its growth would be beneficial to the world. That there's no really inspired explanation of what it means when it becomes this mature tree, and the birds come to nest in it and to nest there. But many commentators look at this as uh, the church being viewed as a beneficial thing, that mustard tree now is beneficial to these birds who can come and rest and make nest in it. And we're going to look at that as basically our final slide here, that the beneficial nature of the church or the kingdom. Everywhere Christ has been taught and followed, there's been a positive impact on that culture. Now, I know there's many blemishes. I know there's many historical evidences of people who claim to be following Christ who basically enslaved people, took their valuables, took their wealth, their land, or whatever. But that wasn't Christ, and that wasn't His church. These were people who claimed to follow Christ, maybe claimed to be His church, but they weren't following His will when they practiced such things. Obviously, just a very simple import of the golden rule: treat people the way you want to be treated. If these people would have done that, they wouldn't have obviously invaded these other places and taken things from people that they had no right to, or enslaved people. But those who truly have taught Christianity and lived it, these cultures definitely have been positively impacted. And even concerning that, the point of how many different institutions of education, how many hospitals, benevolent cultures, societies have been started, all because of Christ and Christianity, and even carry these names. But also, Christ said He came to give us life and to give it more abundantly. And I understand that I don't believe in a health and wealth theology that, if you obey Christ today, your problems will be removed. You'll instantly have better financial health and physical health and all that. But the bottom line is the Bible and Christ gives us the answers to all the questions we have in this life. It gives us hope of a better life. And so when we think about Christianity as being beneficial to the world, it's improved the world as far as the various teachings, as far as how to treat people, how to improve a culture, but also to teach us about heaven and to truly give us that abundant life. Christ reminds us of that in Matthew 11:28 through 30, when He said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And so, as we look at this parable, the sower or the mustard seed, and that grows into a large plant, a large tree, obviously humble beginnings, but also the fact of as the church has matured, the how beneficial it is to the world and necessary. And we need to be reminded of that as Christians. Also just the principle of growth in general. We like instant everything. We want, church to double in size overnight and things of this nature. Individual spiritual growth doesn't happen that way, nor does numerical spiritual growth happen that way in churches. We still desire growth, but it has to, growth obviously takes time. We thank you for being with us tonight in our Bible study, and we hopefully you'll be with us next Wednesday evening.